Everybody, this is Dream, and today we have a nice little 6-game college basketball slate. There's actually a decent amount of value on this slate and a good amount of guys in the mid-level price range today. I'm a little surprised that there's not too many forwards that look very good today, however, so do keep that in mind. But there are a lot of good guards, and then we have some value plays for you as well that look interesting. There's also several injuries on the slate, which I'll talk about at the end of the video when I go through each individual team. But with that said, let's get into the slate itself. Before I get started, can you guys smash that like and subscribe button? It really does help the channel. With that said, so we have a 6-game slate. We have one game that's got that has a spread of 10 points, which is the UNLV game. It's also one of the lower scoring games on the slate. And then we have a close game, which is the highest scoring game on the slate between Marshall and Old Dominion at 150 points. The lowest game on the slate is 129 points, and that's the Nevada-Fresno game. That's also a tight game. So we have 3 tight games and 3 games that have 7 or more point spreads. None of these games look like they're going to be blowouts, but they all look, 3 of them look pretty lopsided, and then the other 3 look really tight. So with that said, let's get into the players I do like today. And we're going to start with Tavion Kinsey for Marshall. Now, Marshall's the fastest, or the highest scoring team on the slate, and they're in the highest scoring game. He also feels a little bit underpriced. He plays nearly 40 minutes every game and scores in double figures most of the time. Also gets assists and rebounds. He hasn't been below 29 fantasy points since December, and this is a close game, which gives him a lot of upside. I think he's probably my favorite player on the slate. He looks really solid today. I think he's definitely going to play well. So he's definitely somebody to consider in your roster. His teammate, Andrew Taylor, is also interesting, though he's actually a little bit more expensive, and he has a little more downside, though he does have a higher upside than Kinsley, but his downside is a little bit more, and he's not quite as good at the peripheral stats comparatively. Kinsley does get more than Taylor does. But like I said, Taylor definitely scores more points sometimes. So I think both of them are actually really viable on the slate. Both have big time upside of anybody on this particular slate. But they are pricey, so do keep that in mind. But I do think you got to utilize at least one of them in your lineups today. Then we're going to look at Colby Jones for Xavier. Now he's a little bit cheaper than the 2 guys I just mentioned. He's only had 2 games all year over 40 fantasy points, so he does have a low floor. Though he did do that against Seton Hall in their 1 game, so that does make him interesting here. He's been very consistent throughout the season. He's not going to kill you, but he also is one of the few guys at the guard position that's under 1 fantasy point per minute that I've got on my list here. So do keep that in mind as well. But he is relatively safe. He's a safe play. His price is okay, and he probably won't hurt you. But, for his price, you're probably going to want a little bit more fantasy points out of him. But overall, he's still a safe play on the slate. Then we're going to look at Elijah Harkless for UNLV. He's averaging 1.18 fantasy points per minute, and he's literally the best player on the slate when it comes to that. He's also got some big-time upside here. He's got as much upside as Kinsley has for his team, and his team is also favored to win by 10 points, and he shoots the ball a lot. I do think his minutes will cap after around 30, but he has some really nice upside in this matchup, and UNLV looks like a decent option to get players from today as being one of the higher scoring teams on the entire slate, and I think he's in a good spot. He's somebody I definitely would consider in your lineup. And then we're going to look at Long from Old Dominion. Now, he usually plays a good amount of minutes. He doesn't have the upside of some of the other more expensive options, but he is in a fast-paced game, and he actually has double-double potential. In fact, he's done that in 7 of the last 8 games. He's also been over 25 fantasy points in 4 straight games versus Marshall. So I think he's a great option on the slate. If you want, between him and Elijah Harkless and Colby Jones, I'd probably rank the 3 of them, Harkless, Long, and then Jones. And so all 3 of those guys are viable on the slate. I definitely want one of those guys at least in my lineup today, and their prices are pretty reasonable, so that helps a lot as well. Then we're going to look at Isaiah Hill for Fresno. Now, his team is not favored to win, and they are on the lowest scoring game in the slate, but he's had 5 games versus Nevada, and all of them were over 25 fantasy points, and he doesn't really need that much more to pay off for us. And he's got a good floor and a pretty good ceiling here. He seems priced a little bit lower than he normally is, but he's the best scoring option on Fresno, and if they're going to stay in this game, which it is projected to be a pretty tight game, then he's going to have to play well and score points for them. And so he's the top option from that team and a pretty decent, lower priced player on the slate. Then we're going to look at John Tanjay, I guess, for Colorado State. Sorry if I'm butchering your name. His floor isn't very bad. He also doesn't reach his he also does reach his ceiling a lot for this price, which is nice. And I think he has a decent option here on the slate. He's also priced pretty well here and has some viability due to that price. I think I'm a little surprised that he's priced this low. I expected him to be a little bit more expensive, especially on a team that's favored to win by 7 points and be one of the higher scoring teams on the slate. So I do think he's in a really good spot. He's definitely somebody I would consider at the guard position as a cheaper option. Now we're going to get into our forwards here, and we have a few guys to take a look at. These are my top 3 basically for this forward position. I really only have 4 guys that I think are really that worth considering outside of value plays. Darian Williams for Nevada being the top one. You can make a really good argument for him considering he's played well most of the season. Despite a low floor, he's been over 25 fantasy points in 5 straight games, and he smashed versus Fresno last time they played for 36 fantasy points. His price is just kind of too low for his potential here. Though, again, he does have a low floor, but he has a good ceiling, so I think he's in a good spot, and he's priced pretty fairly. I think you can pretty much, there's not really a lot at forward that I like when it comes to the more expensive plays, but we have some good options here in the mid-level range, which definitely helps build our lineups effectively. Then we're going to look at Eduardo Andre for Fresno. Now, again, his team is favored to lose, and they are the slowest scoring team on the slate. But when he does play over 28 minutes, he's usually a really good play. He's had 3 games and 11 starts where fouls limited him. But he's had 4 games against Nevada where he played in a game against Nevada 4 games ago and had 28 fantasy points, which is where we want him in this one, and I think he can repeat that. He's got good upside for this price, and he's got a pretty safe floor too, despite being on a slowdown game and a tough slate. That last time they played, it was 66-77, as you can see there, and he had 10 points and 8 rebounds. I think he can kind of repeat that, and if he can, he's definitely worth taking a look at on this particular slate. Then we're going to look at Anochi Killen, I guess. Sorry if I'm butchering your name. Anyhow, for Marshall, he has a lower floor than I would like, which is probably why his price is where it's at. But he's been solid lately, having 6 straight games over 19 fantasy points, and he's on the highest scoring team on the slate. And he should play a decent chunk of minutes. He usually plays around 25 minutes a game, sometimes a little bit less, sometimes a little bit more, especially if he gets into a little bit of foul trouble. But overall, he's been relatively safe. He's a decent option on a slate where there's not a lot of great options at the forward position. Then we're going to look at Derico Williams. He's kind of a secondary option outside the top 3 there for Old Dominion. He's a little bit cheaper too, and his usage has risen with Ben Staley being out. So you do want to make sure that Ben Staley's out, but he has played well, and I expect him to continue to play well as long as Stanley is out. If I look at his history, he plays around 25 minutes a game, and he sometimes has foul issues, but he is still viable on the slate. Then we're going to look at our value plays, and we're going to start with Fajon Fields for Old Dominion. He usually plays around 15 to 20 minutes off the bench. He's been over 10 fantasy points in 8 of the last 9 games, so that definitely gives him some upside. And he does have the forward. He does play forward, which makes him a viable, cheap option at that forward position if you want to go with one of these value plays at that position. Then we're going to look at Andre Gustavin for Richmond. Now I've got 2 guys for Richmond, even though this team is not very good. These guys are likely going to start. Gustavin being the main guy here. Their team is favored to lose by 9 points, and they're one of the lowest scoring teams on the slate. But he starts, plays around 27 to 30 minutes. He has some decent upside. He's a little bit safer than some of the other options, especially Fields. And his price is cheap enough that despite the fact that he's had a few sub 10 fantasy point games, he doesn't look too scary. He's also had 9 career games against VCU, and he's been over 12 fantasy points in 7 of them, including 4 straight. And so I think he's going to have some nice upside here. He's also got as much upside as anybody on this slate when it comes to the sub $4,000 players. Then we're going to look at Digi Bailey for Richmond as well. Now, he's literally minimum priced. He does have a little bit of a boost here simply because he's starting. He doesn't play a ton of minutes usually. He usually plays around 18 to 20 minutes a game, give or take some. But he hasn't... he does have a very low floor still. But he does have a little bit of edge being literally minimum price, so he doesn't need much to 5x. He only needs about 10 points, really, to pay off for us. And so he is viable here, but he is very risky. I don't know that he's a great play, but he's an okay play on the slate. Then we're going to look at Shane Noel, last but not least, for UNLV. He started the last couple of games. Sorry, actually just the last game, and it's only started in the season. He's played 27 minutes and got 19 fantasy points. He's played 20 minutes 6 times this season and scored over 15 fantasy points in all of them, which he should be doing again today with the injuries to UNLV. I expect him to continue to play decently well in that situation, and his price is pretty fair. He's probably one of my favorite, him and Gustavin are probably my favorite plays in the sub 5,000 range on the slate. So with that said, that's what I have for my players. Now we're going to get into my team breakdowns, and we're going to start with Marshall here against Old Dominion. Now, Marshall and Old Dominion, this game is a 3-point spread, and it has 150 points, which is the highest on the slate by 10, in fact. And so I think both these teams are viable. As for looking at Marshall, we have Kinsley, Taylor, and Killian all looking very good in this one. And then you can make an argument for Hanglotten and Kirkman. They do play minutes, but they tend to have low usage. This team tends to be very top-heavy with their minutes. They don't go super deep in the bench. So I expect them to play a lot of their guys a lot of minutes and obviously play at a faster pace than anybody else on the slate. And they have the highest scoring option on the slate. And their guys are pretty reasonably priced considering that situation. So it's definitely useful to have a couple guys from Marshall in your lineup. As for Old Dominion here, we're going to take a look at them. Now, Long is the best player on this team, and then you can make an argument with Fields as being a good value play, for them as well. You can make an argument for a few others, but I do feel like the rest of them are mostly overpriced for what they typically do, and so I think Long and Fields are fairly safe and probably the best options on this team. If you need a forward, Fields is definitely somebody to consider. Then we're going to look at Xavier and, not Xavier, but VCU and Richmond. And starting with VCU, they are favored to win the game by 9 points. They have 8 guys that play at least 18 minutes most games. Only Baldwin really breaks the 30-minute per game mark, and he's streaky for DFS at best. Nothing here is super exciting. They're also not favored to score very many points compared to the other games. This is the second lowest game at 133 points. 2 or 3 of them will probably play well for DFS, but figuring out which ones of those 8 is probably not worth the risk, considering more stable options on other teams. If I had to pick 2, I'd probably pick Baldwin and Johns, but there's not a ton here to like all that much. So I am going to probably stay away from VCU for the most part. As for Richmond, this is the lowest scoring team on the slate. They do have 2 value options worth considering in Bailey and Gustavin, but they are somewhat risky, and you could argue that Burton is a top play, but he's a little bit more expensive than most and has less upside and a worse floor than some of the other options. And I don't, aside from the fact there's not many forwards, so that could give you some decision to use him, but I don't really think he's worth it, especially with other options available, and most of the guys don't play a ton of minutes outside of Gustavin and Burton either, so I do think Gustavin is probably the safest play on this team. but it's still not particularly ideal. Then we're going to look at Xavier and Seton Hall. So we'll start with Xavier here. They're favored to win the game by 2 points. They're the second highest scoring game on the slate, and they're one of the higher scoring teams on the slate. There's a low chance that Fremantle might come back today, but I don't think it's likely. And Kobe Jones has played really well with him out. Most everyone else seems overpriced, but you can make an argument for Nunge, who's also played decently with Fremantle out. But I do think Kobe Jones is the best option on this team. Then we're going to look at Seton Hall. They are favored to lose the game, but it's still a pretty tight game here. And they do have one injury that we're not sure about in Richmond, but no one really stepped up last game when he was hurt. And I don't know that anybody looks all that great on this team, as it's not a real fantasy producing team, and they seem to play a pretty decent bench when it comes to minutes and stuff like that. While they don't have many forwards that are really available, I do think that everybody's a little bit overpriced here. So I'm probably going to be steering clear from the Xavier Seton Hall game for the most part. But it does have some interesting upside just because of it's tight and it's a higher scoring game on the slate. And then we're going to look at Wyoming and Colorado State. And we'll start with Colorado State here because they are favored to win by 7. And you can make an argument for Stevens, Tange, or Rivera. But aside from Tange, they don't have there is more upside on other places. And some of these guys are somewhat inconsistent. Obviously, being in the advantage of being on a winning team in a higher scoring game on the slate, you can make a couple arguments for some of those guys, but I don't think it's the best game to really pull people from. Then we're going to look at Wyoming, and Odin and Maldonado have a bit of upside here, but it's not great, and a lot of the guys on this team are way overpriced. This game looks really ugly for them. They're one of the lower scoring teams on the slate, and so I don't really like them as a good option in general, and I'm probably going to stay away from Wyoming overall in general. Then we're going to look at Air Force and UNLV, and we'll start with UNLV, who's favored to win the game by 10 points, which is the highest spread on the slate. They're also in a faster-paced game, so they are projected to actually score the second most points of any team on the slate. They have 2 starters out with injury, which does give some bonus options when it comes to some sort of value plays. But aside from Harkless, who underwhelmed in the 2 games without Rodriguez, the rest of the starters have not been very good. It's hard to like anyone on this team. Harkless is the best bet, but you could make some arguments for Noel and Mocha, and I do kind of like Noel, to be honest. And Mocha, who's $5,000, with Noel being the best option of the 2. I think those guys are going to be starting and have some viability and a plus matchup. And then we're going to look at Air Force. Now, Air Force is an interesting spot here as well. They're favored to lose by 10 points. They do have one player, Rias Pechratis, who looks interesting. Taylor and Heidelberger also look lightly interesting. But they all have low floors, and the team has struggled for consistent play from all of them. I think I'm going to stay away from everybody on this team. But they do have a couple guys that are at least kind of interesting today, despite the fact they have a lopsided game and one of the lower scoring teams on the slate. And then we're going to look at Nevada and Fresno, and we're going to start with Nevada here. Now, Nevada is favored to win this game. This is the lowest scoring game on the slate by a few points, at just 129 points. Though Darian Williams has some nice upside here, and he should play good minutes. Nobody else really looks that interesting, especially because they seem a little bit overpriced for this game. Then we're going to look at Fresno, who is the lowest scoring team on the slate, but they do have some interesting look at Hill and Andre, who do look interesting today with their reduced prices. But there's still better options on the slate. Andre may be the sneaky forward play, simply because there's not a ton of forwards available. So with that said, guys, thank you for liking, commenting, subscribing. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them below, and have a nice day, guys.